Okay. Well, welcome everybody who's joining us online. We have 11 and counting. I think quite a few will be joining us in the next minute or so. My name is Frank Place. I'm hosting this webinar. Our director, Karen Brooks, is traveling. Myself, I'm a senior research fellow with the Policies, Institutions, and Markets program. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the PIM monthly webinar, and this is the third webinar in this 6-month series that we're hoping to have this year. Today's webinar is titled Community Forestry: Where and Why Has Devolution of Forest Rights Contributed to Better Governance and Livelihoods? And I'm very pleased to welcome the speaker, who's actually sitting in the room here in Washington with us, Stephen Lowry. He's currently director of CIFOR's Equity, Gender, and Tenure Research Program, leading a team of 9 scientists and research associates based at CIFOR offices in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He himself is based at their headquarters in Bogor. He also co-leads PIM's flagship 5, which is Governance of Natural Resources. Now, Steve has a long career. I'm just going to go over a few highlights. He has published studies and scholarly articles on the social and ecological effects of forest rights devolution, the impacts of land rights formalization on agriculture investment and productivity, and tenure factors affecting adoption of agroforestry technologies in many, many regions of the world. He received a PhD from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1988. And that year, he joined the research staff of the UW's Land Tenure Center, where he was the associate director in charge of Africa programs from 1990 to 92. One of his trivial tasks during that time was to take a young recent graduate named Frank Place, myself, to relocate on a 2-year project to be based at IFPRI in Nairobi. Little did I know, or he knew, that I would last there for 23 years. So I'm always very appreciative to Steve for actually launching my career in the CG. So thank you for that. After that, he joined the Ford Foundation, and he worked there for about 14 years, including the head of the foundation's office for the Middle East and North Africa in Cairo. He was also president of Antioch College in Ohio in 2006 and 2007. He was a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Hauser Center from 2008 to 2013. He then headed a USAID-funded project in Sudan to help strengthen property rights in Sudan, based in Juba. Then he also served as the global practice leader for land tenure and property rights at DAI, a Washington-based consulting group, from 2011 to 2014. And then in 2014, he joined CIFOR, where he remains today. So before I hand it over to Steve, and before we start, let me just say a few words about the structure of the webinar. Steve will begin very shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. Then we will proceed to a moderated Q&A session. And how we handle that for time and efficiency purposes is that we ask that you type in your comments and questions in the chat window. You should see that on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can at least bring out that screen with the arrow and see the chat box. And type those in, and then as soon as Steve is finished with his presentation, we'll go through and ask as many questions as time permits. So please note that your mics will be muted by the moderator to diminish external noises and disruption. And with those few words, let me turn it over to Steve. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank. And it's so good to be here. We tried to do this webinar, as you recall, in late July. We had some technical problems in Bogor, but we've rescheduled for a time when I'm actually in Washington visiting IFPRI colleagues and have a chance to actually do it from IFPRI offices. So you see the title of and let me thank also Frank for the really nice introduction and the long colleagueship that we've enjoyed over the years. You see the title on your screen, and I'm going to talk at the outset. Actually, it's not moving. Let's see. Okay, there we go. I'm going to speak to the question at the outset of what is community forestry. It's sort of a question, I think, given the title of the program we want to speak to. Community forestry programs began with a focus on involving communities in government programs. I want to emphasize that government programs for restoration and forest protection. And it's important to bear in mind or remind ourselves that really historically the forest estates in developing countries, but also in developed countries, largely are under the ownership of the state, and forest policy is very much grounded in the reality of state ownership of forests. And so it was really an attempt to, gradually, bring communities into reforestation and forest protection programs. Now, these programs have gradually evolved toward more devolution of use and management rights and more active use of forests by the local community. So from its beginnings and kind of, community participation, it's evolved into a greater focus on activities which people carry out by virtue of the rights that they have, the use and management rights that they have to forests. Now, this greater devolution of rights has been promoted by rights groups and donors. You're familiar with groups like RRI and ILC and others, arguing that by assigning greater governance responsibility and clear use and management rights to communities, environmental and livelihood outcomes might be better. And so many of you are familiar with these arguments and with this really movement to promote greater devolution of rights to communities. Now, however, developing country governments have, for the most part, been ambivalent about rights devolution, with a few notable exceptions. So this has been a process of really debate, some struggle, and which goes on to this day. So let me just give you sort of a summary here of the topics that we'll cover in the discussion presentation. First, I'd like to talk about the geography of rights devolution. You'll see that it sort of progress, if you will, varies significantly among Latin America, Asia, and Africa. I'll speak to some literature and research on what I call success factors associated with successful community forestry outcomes. We'll then speak of the significance of property rights as a success factor. The research tends to identify property rights as being key to successful community forestry outcomes. And then we'll do a little bit of sort of looking at the experiences of Mexico, Nepal, and Guatemala, very briefly in terms of their experiences with forest rights, forms and lessons that might be drawn from those experiences. And then I'll speak a bit about the question of investment effects of rights devolution. This is an emerging topic in C4 and in PIM, and it really speaks to some very vexing, difficult problems. And I want to share with you some ideas about what we're learning and how we're approaching better understanding that problem. And then I'll offer some reflections on the future of community forestry. So moving right along, the geography of forest rights, I'm going to present to you 3 slides that show kind of characterize what we call a forest tenure transition. And the first slide relates to a transition. This is between 2002 and 2008. This is a very good study carried out by Hatcher and Bailey in 2011, which I had more recent data I don't, that covers all 3 continents. But you see there's a transition underway in Latin America, where from 2002, about 70% of the forest estate was in the hands of governments. But by 2008, there had been quite a rapid shift, so that only about a third of forest land was in the hands of governments. And there had been sort of significant increase in the proportion of forest under community ownership, that's the green segment, and under private individual firms, that's the purple segment. So what was going on in Latin America that might explain this rapid shift? Well, first of all, just to characterize the approach, forest lands are demarcated and titled typically as collective or communal properties. States retain the alienation rights. That is, once communities get the forest land, they're not really allowed in terms of the bundle of rights to sell those rights to privately. Titles require retention of forest cover. Now, this is a very important point because when we think of the bundle of rights, one of the rights in the bundle is the right to use and manage. And here the use right is restricted to forest-based use rights only. Okay, so this is a very important point. So when these rights are devolved, we're not really talking about the whole bundle of rights being devolved. A very important bundle is retained, or stick is retained, if you go by the state. That is the right to harvest forests. Emphasis has been on transferring rights to indigenous and ethnic communities. This is a very important feature of rights devolution in Latin America. There's been considerable social mobilization by indigenous peoples and civil societies, which has been key in promoting and ensuring tenure reform implementation and monitoring the progress in defending the rights. We see in many settings that there's sort of a statement in new policies and laws supportive of rights devolution, but the actual sort of execution and implementation of those policies and laws tends to lag. And that's a very kind of significant feature of forest tenure reform around the world, really. But in Peru, for instance, there's been some real progress where over 10 million hectares have been titled to about 2,000 native communities, constituting about 20% of the national forest area. There's considerable diversity also in tenure models, which I'll just mention. Types here: indigenous territories, extractive reserves, agro-extractive forestry settlements. Concessions, such as in Guatemala, we'll speak more about that. So there's been quite a bit of experimentation. Now, in contrast, we look at Africa, and we find that during the same time period, there's been hardly any discernible devolution of rights to communities or to private individuals. And the Africa experience has been quite different. And these are some sort of aspects of it I want to note, that there's been sort of a focus on rights devolution. There's sort of been a focus in the policy arena and in agencies and among donors on benefit sharing arrangements. They're often linked to REDD+, payment for environmental services schemes. These tend to be administered by public or nonprofit organizations exercising really discretion over the terms and conditions of the benefit transfers. They're often expensive to administer and generate high transaction costs for government agencies and village participants alike, and rely on the continuization of donor funding, the kind of carbon markets that, so the market-based carbon trading as a basis for funding PES programs has not gotten a lot of traction, as many of you know. There's also been some focus on establishment of local forest user and conservation groups licensed to exercise limited use rights in return for providing conservation services. Now, these programs, a good example is Kenya's program, the Community Forest Associations, that were established in law in the 2005 Forest Reform Act, where communities, the law is pretty clear. The idea is to bring communities more into conservation activities. It doesn't speak much to questions of use, timber production, harvesting, and so on. And registration as a community forest association requires preparation of a detailed management plan specifying conservation program and activities and the permitted extractive activities. The information required in designing the plan is pretty sophisticated. It requires effectively communities to hire professional foresters, and the CFA management plan approval process faces delays. This is sort of another theme, which is that once rights are ostensibly secured, there tend to be a whole set of regulatory and permitting procedures that are sort of laid on top that really, in many cases, effectively inhibit use of the forest resources. There's been some exceptions to that. But what about Asia? Now, we look at the graph, we see that it appears there hasn't been a significant shift away from state ownership during this period. But Asia is sort of interesting because it's characterized by considerable experimentation and some interesting sort of country-level experiences. One obvious one is Nepal's 1993 forest rights devolution, which of course was some years before 2002, which was the benchmark year for the study that I've been citing. And so there's been real progress in effectively devolving rights. There are about 20,000 community forest user groups hold rights to forests covering about 25% of Nepal. believe that that the rights devolution has contributed to significant increases in forest cover. That is, management by the user groups, better conservation and management practices have really been a positive effect, but the livelihood outcomes are mixed or uncertain, and these are topics that C4 and others are looking into. There's also the significance of large rural outmigration as a factor that's perhaps reduced pressure on forests, and this is not fully understood, and this is something our colleagues are also looking at. But Nepal overall appears to be sort of a very interesting case. Now, many of you are familiar with India's Joint Forest Management Program, also begun in sort of the 1980s. Here, the notion is that communities will protect forests from fire, illegal grazing, timber cutting in exchange for use of non-timber forest products, or here actually I'm characterizing as non-wood forest products. There's been differences among Indian states with respect to success or failure, and the nationalization of the non-wood forest product markets recently in some states has reduced returns to beneficiaries. So sort of a mixed experience there. It's a sort of context where sort of co-management models tend to retain for the state the greater share of management and use rights, and require whatever communities do, they do to a fairly specified, a detailed plan. Now, Vietnam's very interesting because there's something called the Forest Land Allocation Program, where the approach is based on individual family lease rights to forests of up to 50 hectares of area. And there's some evidence to suggest that this has contributed to considerable afforestation and reforestation in many parts of Vietnam, including in sloping areas of sloping hillsides. Indonesia is attempting to devolve use and management rights somewhat on the Nepal model to some indigenous communities, subject once again though to approved plans and quite strict use conditions. And implementation has been quite slow due to the heavy planning requirements. So here's what this is an attempt really to provide a graphic that sort of sums up kind of the global trends, if you will. And you see from right to left, kind of in the arrow there, the kind of tenure reform innovations that go from more rights on the right to fewer rights on the left, and we see an association with rights based on, or models based on a higher range of rights in Latin America, kind of a diversity of approaches in Asia, and not a strong rights-based kind of approach in Africa. Now, there's lots of nuance, of course, in any kind of graphic like this, but I hope you find it useful. So let's talk a little bit then about community forestry success factors. And don't flip out over this graphic, but I do want to refer you to the article by Baines et al. 2015, and there's a bibliography at the end of the presentation, where Baines and his colleagues did a very thorough study of the experience with community forestry implementation in 3 countries where community forestry has featured quite highly in the last 20 to 25 years. That's Philippines, Nepal, and Mexico. And the red words indicate the 5 potential success factors that they evaluated. So I just really want to draw your attention to those 5 success factors that they looked into. And by success, let me just name, say parenthetically, I mean, you might be asking success against what criteria? And what they did was look at studies that were multidimensional, great variety in terms of the aims of the programs, and they really sort of went by the sort of stated goals of the individual projects they were looking at. So if projects were about increasing forest cover and reducing degradation, then if that was achieved, that was a success factor. If it was about livelihoods, then that was, so it's basically what the studies were considering as being what the activities were. So you see the 5 factors from the right. We have property rights, we have government support, this sort of in the form of public goods and extension. Moving over to the left, you see there's benefits. Then there's we move up, and it's community forest group governance, that's local governance and leadership, and then up at the top you've got socioeconomic gender inequality. And so the hypothesis would be less inequitable communities might have higher levels of success, or where there's high levels of inequality, that success may be elusive. Now, here's where they came out in their study, looking at those 5 factors. They found that secure tree and land property rights were necessary conditions for the success of community forestry programs. They weren't sufficient in and of themselves, but they were necessary. Secondly, material benefits to community members were found to be necessary conditions. Once again, they may not be sufficient, but they're necessary to catalyze and motivate community participation and engagement. The other factors, well, they were important in many settings, but not always decisive in terms of their contributions to success. For instance, with respect to number 3, socioeconomic status and gender-based inequality, there's sort of high levels of structural inequality in Nepal's rural areas related to caste, for instance. And they found that in Nepal that the programs and the local forest community groups took pretty good account of the structural inequality in ensuring that the poorest sections of the community benefited fully from or fairly from the program. So there are ways of mitigating the effects of inequality. So then, we get to this point about the significance of property rights. On the left, you see the kinds of property rights that are considered, important to catalyzing local action, access to land and withdrawal resources from it, manage and improve the land, exclude others from it, that is, others who are not bona fide members of the community, and then to sell or lease it. Now, importantly, as these rights are lost, security of tenure decreases and people's motivation for community forestry is subsequently reduced. That's according to Baines. And we see this in several cases, and some of which I'll point out. Communities having strong rights, then there being sort of an erosion of those rights that are diminishing the effectiveness of the programs and the activities. Here's the problem. Governments only partially devolve management rights for reducing tenure security. For instance, in the Philippines, there were promises of rights to land and trees, but there was sort of a lack of willingness, or there was a statement of a willingness to revoke community forest agreements arbitrarily, which seriously weakened the community forest groups and the ability for them to maintain their control. In Vietnam, similarly, it was found that formal devolution of land management from the state to community forest user groups sometimes did not translate into actual rights, resulting in opportunistic over-harvesting of residual native forests. People got the forest as they could. And then in this very interesting study by Holland and Ecuador found that forest-friendly collective titles. Now, forest-friendly title, once again, is a title where you have very limited rights to actually harvesting trees, okay, which we find is fairly typical in Latin America. They reduced deforestation rates in Ecuador, but the use restrictions were met with resistance by the local people. So it's not clear just how sustainable that sort of model is, or if more can be done to put in place plans that allow for higher rates of sustainable timber harvesting from these forests in ways that ensure continuing community engagement. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit here about some findings from some these 3 countries, Mexico, Nepal, and Guatemala, because I think they're interesting in their own ways. Mexico has done something very interesting, beginning in like 1986, where they really shifted forest rights. They grounded forest rights into land rights. And so one of the kind of tensions here is that the Ministry of Interior may have jurisdiction over land rights, but the Ministry of Forestry continues to exercise administrative and other rights over forests. And then in Mexico in 1986, the law effectively removed regulation of forests in ejidos from the jurisdiction of the forest authorities and put it under, really linked it to land rights. So here we see the 1986 forest law transferred decision-making powers over forests to ejidos on condition that they meet sustainable forest management standards, once again a management plan. So the role of the state was reduced essentially to supervision and support, and not to the sort of direct regulation and management that came through the forestry agency. And so it was also found that in Mexico that the agrarian reform laws, not the forest reform laws, have been more crucial in fostering community forest enterprises than specific forest legislation. So people derive their capacity to invest and utilize forest resources on the basis of the agrarian law and not the forestry. Agrarian reform distributed forest lands to communities and provided a template for community governance that could later serve as an institutional platform for the development of community forestry enterprises, which tend to take on characteristics of social enterprises, which we'll talk about later. Now, Nepal, you've got this interesting case. Here's the background details. The key date was 1993 and the formalization of the Forest Act, which gave quite a strong range of rights to community forest user groups. Today, over 40% of the population is involved in community forestry programs of some kind, with 20,000 forest user groups, managing almost 33% of Nepal's forest area. Forest cover has increased by 13% between 1990 and 2014, more or less, during the period of the rights devolution. And previous to that, the Nepal forests were in very bad shape. Countries are facing horrific flooding and losses of soil due to lack of tree cover. So here's finding some research that C4 and Forest Action and Nepal recently carried out on the investment effects of the rights devolution. So most of our informants, we looked at 12 community forest user groups around the country, believe that the forest rights granted to communities were a necessary precondition to the investments that occurred. Generally, good provision was made to ensure that disadvantaged community members benefit from investments in enterprises. I spoke about that earlier. There's evidence that rights devolution has restored and deepened community cohesion. This is a very important point. You know, without rights, communities don't have really a basis for collective action. And I think there's a tendency to overlook how the devolution of rights can really be something that communities can do something with. In terms of focusing on better forest management and forest-based livelihoods. The regulatory burden, however, remains quite heavy. This is according to our informants. Stymies investment and regulations are inconsistently applied, and as a result, informants' perceptions of tenure security, while still higher than pre-reform, declined significantly from the highs immediately post-reform, that is, in the early 1990s. Now, Guatemala is very interesting, and C4 is also carrying out some work there with PIM support, working with the Forest Association there that's supporting concessions and biodiversity. So the biosphere encompasses about 2.1 million hectares of lowland tropical forests, the largest contiguous tropical forest north of the Amazon. And the reserve has a number of objectives, but I want to really focus on the concessions which were established really since 1995. There are 14 concessions within the MUZ, which is the multiple use zone, sort of inside the biosphere, where uses like timber extraction are permitted. And so there are 12 community and 2 industrial concessions. And they have 25-year concession terms, like a timber concession. And its harvesting is based on a Forest Stewardship Council approved management plan, which is very important and makes sense. So the results are quite promising. There's sort of an annual deforestation rate between 2001 and 2009 of about 0.5% compared to the pre-concession rate of 1.5%, and compared to the 2.0 per year deforestation rate in Japan, the area outside of the concession. So some real achievement here. most timber sales, and this is what the plan permits, the FSC approved management plan, it permits harvesting, extraction of high value timber. So most timber sales are generated by mahogany and cedar, which are not in great supply, raising concerns about the economic sustainability of concessions, given the limited supply. And there are difficulties to commercialize non-traditional species, although there's been quite a bit of evidence or focus and energy put into developing supply chains for other timber and non-timber products. And C4 colleagues and biodiversity colleagues will be in Patan, in fact, next week to help convene a workshop of local researchers on the progress of the concessions as they approach sort of the end of the term, which is coming up in the next 5 years. Now, this question of investment is one that really, occupies our thinking quite a bit these days, because I call it sort of the new, the new frontier, if you will, or the new phase in the whole question of forest common property rights management. And the first phase, of course, is very much focused on the question of rights devolution. And there's been some progress over the last 20 or 30 years in devolving rights to communities. There's still a long way to go, arguably, and there's still a lot to learn. But then the question arises, what do communities do when they get the rights? And so research is going on with respect to environmental outcomes, livelihood outcomes. But I think a particularly interesting question, and one that's very complex, and I said at the outset, kind of vexing. I think it's sort of perplexing for a lot of people because the solutions don't seem all that evident, is what might we expect with pathways of investment once rights are devolved. And we think of investment here in terms of investment in enterprises, community and private and otherwise, that make use of, in a sustainable way, forest resources. So here the notion is, like I suggested earlier, that you give communities rights, you catalyze community action, but rights can also catalyze investment in community forest enterprises. So here the notion is that we're really talking about a process, that I think the investment community, we talk a lot about, these enterprises, though, they're not commercial, they require a lot of grant funding. Well, basically, I think we want to suggest here that that's to be expected. But we also want to contextualize these public sector grant investments and so on as part of a process. And I want to suggest here sort of 3 stages in a process that with some patience we might really see, and proper foreplanning, we might see some long-term benefits. So rights devolution triggers new kinds of action: social action, organizational action, and economic at the local level. And externally, very importantly, it lays foundations for investment in new forms of community forest enterprise. There's 2 points I want to ask you to keep in mind. First, we are adding a time dimension to understanding investment readiness as a process of internal and external social and economic development that unfolds through stages. And second, I want to bring out the aspects of the social character of the process, determined by the social collective character of the resource rights. Once again, we're talking about a tenure system that's based on social tenure. That is, people have access to land and forests in a communal or customary or collective context by virtue of their membership in the community. It's a social right. Okay? And so the members of that community, that is the owners of the resource, will have expectations that there will be fairly widely shared social and economic benefits accruing from their rights ownership. And this is a very important point, I think, that doesn't get maybe sufficient attention. And so we're really thinking about enterprises that take account of the social character of the tenure system. So there are 3 stages I want to suggest, and I'll move along rather quickly here. First of all, once the rights are handed over, imperfectly often, there's a sort of we see inward investment and development of representative institutions. At the community level, we see new private investment in housing, education, health, funded by local savings and remittance flows. We see new community-level organizations form. This is sort of a social capital formation, catalyzed by rights and a new space for decision-making about forest use made possible by less regulation. And then there are some commensurate external actions. There's formation of regional or national organizations or federations representing interests of community user groups. We see this in almost every case where rights have been devolved. Then we move into a stage 2 where community institutions over time, once again, time is a factor here, gain confidence and local leaders and entrepreneurs begin to emerge. So at the community level, we see further development of local social capital, NGO-supported small business projects, improvement of forest conditions, community user groups gain experience in sorting out local conflicts. Emergence of effective local leadership may prove essential to moving into successful stage 2. There tends to be an overestimation of the importance of effective local leadership. We have a strong focus on organizations and organizational capacity and so on. But leadership is a key factor, and it comes from many sources. First, the first community forest enterprises emerge during this stage, and then these are met by a set of external actions. There's sort of, especially if there's what we might call forestry reform. There's tenure reform plus an investment, mainly public investment, in roads, training, health, education, i.e. in public goods, being important to help ensure success alongside the new rights. This is sort of analogous to the agrarian reform notion of the programs in the 60s. That is the full package. It's never enough to extend rights. There needs to be supportive institutional and technical support. Then we move into potentially a stage 3, where stronger local social capital attracts new forms of bridging capital. At the community level, we see the community forest user groups, they're licensing and processing goods for the external market, licenses to CFEs with investment in capital equipment in the form of donor grants and concessionary loans. CFEs have a social character in that 4 sections of the community may be principal suppliers of non-timber forest products and labor. And then external actions, where federations of forest user groups focus initially on ensuring efficient government implementation of rights commitments, but may begin to give greater attention to promoting commercial investment, including by advocating for investment-friendly regulations. We're seeing this very much in the group with the association in Nepal, and I think we're seeing it also in Guatemala. And then certified use and extraction plans meet the investment conditions of the ESG, that is environmental, social, and governance. These are socially responsible investors. And, a good example would be, that, investors would be attracted to Guatemala concessions because, that is ESG investors, because the timber, as the coffee and other settings and so on, or the cacao, is meeting FSC certified standards. Okay, so now we're almost to the end. And I want to offer a couple of reflections on the future of community forestry in light of what I've spoken to over the last 30 minutes or so. First of all, the powerful drivers of change in the forestry sector are here to stay. This is really a very interesting time to be alive and working on forestry, because the whole sector is foment, and this is due to these claims for rights by communities and people, challenging state hegemony in forest governance. Very, very important to be mindful of. Moreover, women and previously voiceless sections of the community are challenging and disrupting how forests are used and governed locally. So, patriarchy is not, or a few number of men make decisions about resource use locally is also being challenged, complicating and enriching the debate on forest governance at the local level. So secure land rights, comes to the Mexico case, can amplify benefits of forest rights reform. And so connecting forest reforms to land reforms, local problems. States will continue to retain an interest in forest outcomes. So there's always going to be a state interest, and a legitimate one, in how forests overall are managed. They provide very important public environmental services, and this will always be a matter of state interest. But advocates and researchers can foster fresh thinking on appropriate state roles, that reduces the overreach that we see often in forest agencies. And donors can support reform of forest agencies. Really, one of the issues that C4 research is identifying with respect to the post-reform period is that if you will, the forest agencies really haven't got the memo. They haven't really worked through what a new rights dispensation and distribution implies for their roles. So they continue in that very strongly traditional historical regulatory role to which they're trained and accustomed. And so, there needs to be support for rethinking what a complementary supportive role for forest authorities would be in a context where communities have the greatest share of rights. This is something that's been overlooked big time by donors, I think, in our attention. Because of the social character of collective tenure, forest enterprises must pursue commercial and social goals simultaneously. This opens up all kinds of new creative opportunities for the character of the firm, the nature of the firm. And there's a lot of ESG funding that's going to be supportive of firms that are meeting environmental, social, and governance standards simultaneously, as well as commercial expectations. Then international agreements such as FPIC, Global Climate Fund, the BDD, the tenure standards, and corporate sustainability commitments pressure on for rights devolution. And I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to respond to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Well, we did get a few comments and questions, so I'm going to try to summarize and group a few together that I think were similar, and so I'll pitch a few to you. I guess I'll just ask you one at a time, and you can go for an answer, unless they're related. So one question we had was, you had mentioned these 5 critical factors, and 2 were necessary conditions, right? And one was the secure property rights.
Yeah.
And but governance of natural resources was not deemed necessary. So there was a question: why is that not? Why is property rights necessary but not the governance of the natural resources, the landscape?
I see. So that would have related to that one of the other 3, which was intra-community governance.
Right. But it didn't turn out to be necessary. So
I think what here what the office would have been looking at would be the performance of the local user group, user group governance, and you're going to see variance in that, and you're going to see some groups perform better than others. But what the group has to have is some rights. What the community have to have is rights over the resource. So I think that's kind of an area where there's different outcomes qualitatively, but they can be masked somewhat if the benefits are sufficient, if enterprises are generating benefits, or if the rights are generally secure.
Good. So now there's a couple of questions that were related, I think, to your second necessary condition of material benefits accruing to communities.
Yeah.
I think so. People were wondering, does that necessarily mean it has to be commercial benefit, commercialized products? Yeah. And if so, maybe that's the first question. And then secondly, if you give some examples, I think you gave an example in one case from Guatemala, I believe, of mahogany. Mm-hmm. But are there some examples from Mexico or Nepal or some other countries of investments you can share?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I mean, Nepal is a great variety of benefits. In a commercial, well, sort of semi-commercial, I mean, there's been an emergence of kind of a wood apple juice supply chain in Nepal that has followed on the rights devolution. Wood apple is kind of something that's like an apple, grows naturally in the forests, and produces a good juice. You get a lot of sugar. And typically the Dalit community members harvest this, consume it. They've also found a market now in local juice processors at the forest level, using juice equipment, often funded by grant funding, that now is linked into new national supply chains that markets wood apple juice. Other examples are charcoal. There are some invasive species in Nepal, lantana, for instance, where everybody wants to see a reduction in cover. And so some new charcoal firms have developed particularly buying semi-processed charcoal from women's groups within the forest. Um, there's tourism-based enterprises that have proved very remunerative to the forest communities in the fall. So those are some examples from Nepal that I'm most familiar with. There are also new supply chains being developed in Guatemala, in the biosphere reserve, that based on non-timber forest products, which I hope to be able to speak more about once I visit next week.
Okay, good. And related to that, have there been some studies about the different marketing models that the communities have been using to really add value to these products and so forth? Is there much known on that already about the best models?
There is. I mean, of course, what you want to see where you can is as much value added to the product within the community, owned enterprise or the local enterprise, as you can. So, for instance, I gave the example of the wood apple. Well, the cases I've seen, the wood apple juice is processed and bottled on site. Okay, so you've got higher levels of employment and value added and supply chain on site. Another really quite fascinating example of Nepal is essence of is lemongrass essential oils, which have actually linked into a global supply chain. And here the lemongrass is harvested from the forest. Communities have expanded areas of lemongrass cover within the forest. And then they've actually purchased quite sophisticated distillery equipment from India to specifications for processing the lemongrass into an essential oil. So that's another example of sort of amplifying returns from investment within the local area. Interestingly, in Nepal, and I think this is the case in maybe some parts of Mexico, the bigger regulatory hurdles relate to timber extraction, and specifically where communities establish their own mills. And so there's been quite a significant challenge there. Although some of the barriers for communities selling timber directly to established commercial mills are starting to fall away, and they're facing fewer regulatory constraints than suppliers of timber from privately held lands, where for certain reasons the regulatory burden is much higher. So we're seeing progress in that area as well.
Right. Good. Maybe a couple of questions about how it's kind of these trends and evolutions and different forms of community forestry. So one question we had was you alluded to before in Africa some of these the programs relying on climate money haven't really necessarily taken off big. So there was a question related to that about the Red Plus programs, where the fundamental rights stay with the state, to as beneficiary. And so how do RED programs, what are their limitations or opportunities for contributing to community forestry?
Yeah. It's a very vital question because, of course, RED Plus really was, as a program, was designed by the donors and others, big donor being Norway, for instance, recognize the rights, the importance of local rights and local ownership of forest and land resources as key to making the model work. Okay, it's sort of a market-orientated model. Benefits go to right holders of the resource. Now, it became pretty clear quite quickly that the kind of thoroughgoing tenure reforms needed to get forest rights in the hands of local communities was not something you do in the context of a donor-led program, even one of such great ambition as Red Plus. And so they had to revert, as you're suggesting, to the reality that the right holder is the state in many contexts in Africa and around the world. And so then that left with the state the discretion with respect to the balance of benefits, the character of benefits, the nature of the incentives. And, states have different estimations of what kind of incentives people might or might not respond to. And of course, there's significant overhead costs, administrative costs, so the amount of the actual donor funds or the carbon related funds is quite diminished. And we see this, I think, there needs to be, if there's going to be a marketplace, you need owners and buyers. They meet, it's nothing to economic theory, and they negotiate. And, that what's on offer from many of the state administered programs is not a negotiated rate and or benefit, nor one that sufficiently incentivizes people to take off the conservation practices that they're meant to leverage the payments in that approach. So it's a structural problem. And there are other problems related to the price of carbon and so on that relate to particular sustainability issues. So Red Plus has very important goals, but operates within some limited structural policy problems.
Then another question came in about, so we observed that in Africa there was not much change and shift of ownership of forests. So, but a question came into was wondering whether there could still be a subtle shift in the sense it might be still publicly controlled, but it could have been developed from federal to state or local district levels. Do you observe some of that going on?
Not a lot. Not a lot. I mean, something that I've been very interested in is the movement towards statutorily recognizing customary tenure rights at a status equal to private land and state land. And we've seen reforms of this character underway in a number of countries, including Kenya, by the way, which is what the 2009 land policy was meant to achieve with respect to tribal lands. Botswana is probably the leading example in this case. But in terms of countries with major tropical forest cover, for instance, like in Central Africa, or DRC, Congo, there's been, the quite limited debate on and discussion on forest rights devolution or land rights devolution. I mean, it's largely in the hands of the state. Although there's some really promising experimentation going on in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Some good reform laws in Tanzania, kind of mixed experience with implementation so far. I think coming back to the point made earlier about, the need to work with the forest agencies as kind of targets and opportunities for reform themselves.
Right.
There needs to be some, reform thinking there because they carry this tremendous sense of obligation and responsibility for the well-being of the forest estate. And they're also obviously links to commercial and other interests. So this sort of architecture really needs to be looked at very carefully.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll have two more questions. Hopefully, time for two more. What time is it now? We've got 7 minutes left according to my clock. So one is related to kind of where we're moving towards in terms of models for community forests. And I think you had mentioned the fact that there could be overregulation. When there could be devolution, but with overregulation. And we had a comment coming in about, but be careful, if you don't regulate at all, you could also have bad effects. So one question is related to, I guess, this regulation aspect. What have we learned about too much or too little?
Yep.
And then what does that also say in terms of where, with all the experimentation going on and learning and so forth, where is there some common elements of models where we're headed towards?
Yeah, no, that's a great comment from the listener.
Yeah.
And it's no question that, and as I said, there's a public interest in the wealth, health and well-being of the forest estate. Trees loom large. They're significant from a climate change point of view, from an environmental services point of view with respect to flooding and so on and so forth, and also very important economically. So there's no question about that. It just, the experience is very contextual and specific. Speaking of Nepal, there's a regulation that disallows establishment of a forest enterprise closer than 1 kilometer from the forest. Okay, so what's the rationale for this regulation? Then it's been negotiated to, 500 meters. So that's heading in the right direction. But in rural Nepal, there's hardly any sites less than 1 kilometer from a forest. And, I think the original motive was really about timber mills. They should be able to see them on the road, shouldn't be deep in a forest. That's all understandable, but adjustments need to be made so that if you have a an apple juice mill, you really want it close to the product.
Yeah.
So these are things that can be looked at, and I think what we're seeing in these national association of user groups like ACOPOP in Guatemala, I forget the name of the wonderful group in Nepal, serve this very important function of advocacy, lobbying, so on the regulatory environment, particularly affecting investment and enterprises.
Good. There was a question we got related to whether the latest trends. Is there any trend for support for community forestry? Is it dwindling, or is interest picking up?
Yeah.
And maybe within that context, could you reflect on a couple other things that came in? One was about, because of course we got people on different sides of the fence, right, including some maybe way on one side that says we shouldn't be harvesting anything out of forests, that we need to keep them in pristine condition. Right. And then there's others who are much more maybe market and commercial and income oriented. Yeah. So how are those playing out at the global level, those discussions in that context? And then another subset question is, are there any, noticing the differences across the different continents in progress, are there South-South learning initiatives underway to share lessons? And so maybe we think about the trends and
sure,
handle those.
Exactly. Yeah. No, this question of protected forests versus, say, community forests, it's a very important question. And, it's often the case that, forests in any given country are subject to high levels of protection. They're designated as protected forests. Use is very limited. And so we're often talking, for instance, in the Indonesia case, of the reform with respect to rights of indigenous people, is for them to have a greater number of rights in protected forests. But at the same time, no one's talking about degazetting a large section of Indonesia's protected forests from a protected forest status. You're usually talking about a small proportion of the national forest estate being made available for higher levels of use on a sustainable basis to indigenous and other communities. So, the protected forest status is not being threatened as a general principle. And I think there's a recognition of the biodiversity and other values associated with forest protection as a form of nature protection. But there's these tensions that are going to be present. Now, just parenthetically, let me mention that the real drivers of change of forest cover, including historically protected forests, it's not the claims of communities or indigenous people. It's the claims of large scale of tropical commodity producers. Between 2000 and 2010, about 40% of the natural tropical forest cover was lost, attributable to production of 4 tropical commodities: soy, palm oil, timber, and beef. So these are the major drivers of forest loss. It's removal of natural forest cover for production of commodities, and not for the claims of. And I do believe that these plans that involve some level of negotiation about timber use and so on in the context of the title are appropriate. But be mindful that the land lost, the 40% lost over that 10-year period, was in the hands of governments, of forest agencies, and registered lease and other arrangements allowed the loss of that forest for purposes, for other commercial purposes. So with respect to South-South learning, there's quite a bit going on, I think, among the countries that are undergoing reform or contemplating reforms. There can always be more. C4, with its global comparative study on tenure, doing work in Peru, Uganda, Indonesia, other countries. I think part of that work is convening project groups that provide guidance to our research. The World Bank Conference on Land and Poverty, we had a large number of people together in the same room. And over the last few years, various people sharing knowledge and experience. And kind of leaders are going to want to listen to the experiences of their peers in other countries where they're struggling with these kinds of problems.
You see, just to restate a one question, as we know, this will be the last one for everyone. So do you see the trends in that increasing or decreasing the interest of governments to invest their own resources in that and donors as well?
I do. There's real interest in many governments. There's no question about it. And you tend to find, in Indonesia, there's in the government, the ministry, there's a division of forestry, and they have a mandate from the president to devolve, social forest, devolve 12.7 billion hectares of forest land to political leadership with the right capacity in the ministries. There's real interest in trying to figure it out.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Steve. This was very interesting, and thanks to all who participated. And I'm sorry for those who we didn't get to your questions. There was not enough time for everyone, but we do have the questions, and we're happy to forward them on to Steve, and he can. And if you also are interested, you can forward them to Steve. And a few of you were asking about the availability of the PowerPoint slides, and they will be available on the PIM Policies, Institutions, and Markets website page. So pim.cgiir. So .org, yeah. So once again, thanks to everyone, and we hope to hear or listen to many of you again in about a month when our next one is going to occur. Thank you.